Everybody, I'm here with Douglas Batchelor, who is a podcaster with What Magic Is This? Also, I'm a member of his Patreon, and he is my favorite sorcerer in Canada. And we are here today to talk about the Ten of Swords, which is kind of a dark card, Doug. It's
Yeah.
Despondence, the White Oak. Tell me, Doug, first of all, thanks for hopping on, and
No
tell me
problem.
why that card? Why did you pick that card?
I want to start basically by saying that when people do get decks of tarot cards, I've noticed kind of two things that occur when you get up into the higher pips or the minor arcana. Is that especially with something like the Ten of Wands, baton, rods, whatever you want to call them, they're usually displayed in two ways. Either it's very, very ordered, so you'll have the rods or the batons overlapping each other, and it still looks ordered but kind of messy. And then there's the other side in which it's almost like the artist or the card itself, the images on the card, it's like somebody took a bunch of kebab skewers and just dropped them. And so it's all over the place. Now, obviously, I like the ones that are a little bit towards the latter, right? So I like ones that are all over the place. It is just interesting that I think that you and David decided to choose an old tree, a dying tree that I believe is in a White Oak in New Jersey that's about 600 years old.
Yeah.
And what's interesting about trees, especially when they die, is that it's a slow death, truthfully. And I grew up in rural Alberta where I had access. I was raised in the foothills. So I had access to tons of forests, and the dead trees in and around that area were always my favorite thing to look at, to go towards. And I like what you two did with this card, specifically because you were talking about how it's not so much about um, irredemptive actions. It's more about sorrow. And the word that you use on the card is despondent. The only books that I read more than magic, besides, books on history, are books on biodiversity and ecology and ecosystems, and books of things that we'd like to call nature. Growing up in Alberta, in rural Alberta in the foothills, what was always more interesting to me was noticing that dead trees seem to, and this is somewhat probably area specific, seem to hold more life than live trees do. Although live trees do provide nests for birds and whatnot, um, dead trees, they can have everything from martins to other small birds, woodpeckers, many, many insects. And so I want people to try and sit with this idea, because the idea of despondency, if we're actually to go to like an etymological, I don't even know if I'm saying that word correctly, and I have it pulled up here. It just basically comes from despondentum, but there was a phrase that was used back in the day that was animam despondere, which literally means to give up one's soul. Now, the idea of death is one that I think a lot of people have a hard time coming to grips with, and specifically these days. I don't want to get too current, but we are surrounded by this idea of death, and our first reaction is indeed one of despondency. But I want people to maybe try and flip that and try and stay with the idea of seeing death as a way to not only bolster, but embiggen and embolden life in some way. You start to notice that the things that other people would see as decay and rot and putrefaction is, in fact, almost more alive than the things that are really pretty to look at, things that are full and lush. So there's a great lesson to be held with the idea of a slow death of a tree and the slow death of what we would consider something as beautiful as an old um, monolith of a representation of something like nature. We can say, yes, it is sad that the tree is going away, but we think we need to take that thought a little bit further. Now, I've always been one of those people that has been somewhat fascinated by death. I'm still to this day very fascinated by the idea of death. A lot of my magic is fairly necromantic. But as far as what we can bring into life these days is that despondence doesn't mean you have to give up your soul. It is a registering of that a soul has been given up, right? And I think there's a crucial distinction there. So with these ideas of death, and the constant talk about ideas of death, that we have to not give in to this idea that it is merely an end, that it is a complete shutting off of a communication with not just the person that was held, but the ideas, the memories, and the things that they stood for. The difference is between what a tree does is that that is a long process of time, whereas with a human being, usually with a sickness that lasts either a couple of years to a couple of months to even a day, is that it just the time scale is much, much different. So I think that more than anything, we have relegated the idea of death and decay and disease to a place that is, at this point, somewhat detrimental and deleterious to us as a species. I think that cemeteries, there should be more of them. I actually do think that there should be a place where common mourning is actually done. Death is an incredible teacher, and in every way, shape, or form. So I want people to really try and sit with this idea of when they are confronted with the idea of death, or with the idea of decay, or even with the idea of despondency for life events or for things that have occurred with you in your life, is that it doesn't have to be giving up one's soul. It can more like be registering that a soul has been given up, but where do you go from there? Death, in my opinion, is perhaps the greatest teacher that we have right now. And to try and meddle with something that is so fundamental to us as a species, I think has steered us in very, very interesting, albeit perhaps not the most beneficial positions in life. So I want people to really stick with the idea of a dead or a dying tree. And when next time you go out, as beautiful it is to look at the greenery, especially because spring is around the corner, to look at the idea, to see these wonderful new things that are bringing forth new life, shift your gaze. One of these walks when you're going out, shift your gaze to the things that are starting to die. And just notice that there is a fecundity of life to be seen there. It just might not be exactly the same as the things that we'd like to see when we watch nature documentaries. The beauty that is within death and a state of despondence is truthfully a very beautiful thing. And you can take it from me, a necromancer, that I think the better lessons, not the better, that grander lessons are to be sought when one is confronted with a death, whether it be a slow or a fast one.
Can you tell me, do you feel like tarot is a language, or is it something, is that different from astrology? I'd just like to hear your take on that comparison.
Tarot is interesting because it almost seems like it's its own thing. And it was such an interesting story wherein how the history, because I'm such a history nut that I like to know about the complete history of something not before engaging with it, but I just find that it really helps with understanding how it came about. Tarot is this incredibly strange, it's wonderful, brilliant history full of, well, for one, like slavery and using certain groups of people in certain areas. Truthfully, it came from Mamluk cards out of Egypt, right? And then finding its way around the Mediterranean, eventually looping its way into Italy and becoming something totally different. It was the gift that you could give a king or a very rich aristocrat who already had everything. You would gift them tarot cards, and they would look very different, and they would have incredibly interesting and intricate symbols on them that we're still to this day debating, like, where did these symbols come from? And then eventually it shifts through there, and it gets pulled through something like Atea and his idea of this comes from Egypt, and then through Eliphas Levi saying, well, he combines it with Jewish Kabbalah, to the 19th century where it becomes like this was knowledge from ancient Egypt. Well, not actually correct, but kind of correct, but in a very different way. Tarot is, sorry, I'm going a bit long-winded here. Tarot is almost so self-contained. Would I call it a language? I don't know if I would. There really isn't.
It's almost an entity, it sounds like, rather than a language, right? Like, so if astrology is a language, tarot is almost its own entity. That's interesting to think of.
It's so self-contained within its own iconography and within its own story. To call it merely a language, I think, would be a disservice to it. Not to say that saying astrology a language diminishes it in any way, but to hold with this thing where you can put in so little effort to be able to get such incredible and enlightening introspections from pieces of cardboard and images is, yeah, I agree. I don't want to throw the E word egregore out there, but tarot has always seemed to be one of those things where it's on a path of its own. It has agency and it has some kind of spirit that is incredibly fascinating to me. And to call it a language, I think would not sufficiently sum it up. The tarot exists unto itself. And what is so unbelievable about it is that the more things that you try to hang on it, to try and define it, it shifts and allows itself to be seen in a totally different way, which is just one of the most incredible things about it. And to this day, it's like, now after this episode, it's like, well, time to go back to the tarot. It's because it is incredible. And I see why people are loving tarot cards these days. And my very first time seeing tarot cards, I literally stole money from my dad so that I could buy my first tarot deck, which was the Aquarian Tarot, which was a tarot.
Ooh, that's a good one. Yeah.
Yeah, it was fairly popular in the 70s and the 80s, but I had to have this thing. And since then, and that was before I was doing any kind of practical magic, I had to have this thing, and because it is so incredible in its capacities and its depth in being able to tell you as much as you want to meet it on what level you want to meet it on. So yeah, it's language. I don't know if you can call it a language. I think it's its own thing, and it's fine being its own thing.
Yeah. I like the idea that the E word's okay with me on that one. I like that. I'm not sure that's it, but that's closer than language, right? I think that's good. I like. Awesome. Douglas, thank you so much for being on. I really appreciate it. This has been a great talk.